Hello, my name is Jeremy Bray, and I would like to welcome you to an interesting exercise in speculation. Everyone loves to ask what if, but few are able to actually connect the dots of causality and come up with a good example of what might have been from an alternate chain of events. Be that as it may, let us take a journey now to see what might have happened if Russia had won the space race.
And so we go back in time to the Cold War. The United States and Russia were locked in a terrible and largely secret struggle for supremacy across all avenues of pursuit. At first, the two superpowers were trying to keep things from getting out of hand, seeing as how they had just finished World War II and neither were keen on starting a third. Each side knew that the other had a nuclear arsenal in an effort, so they both said, to deter other countries from attempting to use them and kept each other under constant surveillance and largely in check by way of a thinly veiled threat of mutually assured destruction, meaning that if one side launched a nuke, the other would retaliate in kind, assuring that both sides would be destroyed. As there is nothing that would be quite as hot as the wind from a nuclear blast, of which there would be several in a nuclear war, both sides chose to christen the struggle as a Cold War. Nuclear threats aside, it was a time of vicious espionage which further fueled the conflict. When Sputnik 1 was launched into low Earth orbit by the Russians in 1957, it served as a wake-up call to a largely complacent United States that they had fallen quite far behind in the scientific pursuits, and thus inspired a long period of one-upsmanship that continued to the point that, looking back now, it resembles the fistfights and petty squabbles of two rival schoolboys, each trying to outdo each other and therefore earn the approval and attention of the prettiest girl in the class. Most of Russia's space race technology was based off the tech that was stolen from other foreign powers, because prior to Sputnik, they were attempting to play technological catch-up as a result of being rather isolationist for the better part of the previous 2 centuries. After all, it is far easier to steal something than it is to engineer it yourself. Even still, they still had to reverse engineer everything that they stole so that they could adapt it to their own technology. Stealing a new power source is all well and good, but if you can't make it run your equipment, it's as useless as if you had never had it to begin with. But let us say that they were able to make things work. Technological portion of the Cold War era Soviet Union was, to say the least, disorganized. There were multiple people in charge of overlapping projects who were in direct competition with each other for resources, funding, and for project priority. This means that the Soviet government would have had to restructure itself to be far more efficient and prevent these overlaps. So okay, we now have an organized and efficient communist government that has a clear focus and a directive to put a man on the moon. Soviet agents infiltrate the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration and steal the US-built flight computer for the glory of Mother Russia. The now efficiently run tech arm of the Soviets is able to reverse engineer the computer system and put it into effect in order to help make the complex flight maneuvers necessary for spaceflight. The end result of this accelerated and more efficient space program allows the Russian cosmonauts to make their initial launch date because they have been able to overcome the difficulties with their booster technology and have now landed a man on the moon in the early months of 1968, while the US is still making its preparations for Apollo 11. So now what? Well, according to the Soviet propaganda at the time, the USSR had no intention of just making it to the moon. They had devised an extensive plan to colonize the lunar surface and use it as a way station for missions to explore and study both Venus and Mars with the eventual goal of colonizing the Red Planet. After Russia has landed on the moon, the US would not have lost interest in the space race and would have seen it as an endeavor of paramount importance to be the first to establish a permanent base on the moon, mostly for research purposes, of course, before continuing on toward building the first permanent lunar settlement. Of course, this would be ridiculously expensive, and there is no way that either country would be able to afford to do this on their own, which would lead to some eventual and begrudging cooperation between the two superpowers. Preventing the degradation of the space programs would push education to ever higher levels and would encourage other countries to join the pursuit of space explorations, which would eventually result in the multinational cooperative endeavors, which would, by the end of the 2030s, bring about the first self-sustaining lunar colonies and allow humanity to venture forth to the other planets in our system. Going further in time, I believe that before the end of the 21st century, humanity would have set most of its domestic squabbles aside and become more focused on interplanetary expansion. This will, of course, eventually lead to some colonies wishing to declare independence of the Earth-based governments and could eventually lead to an interplanetary war the likes of which we have never seen. But there is always the potential that our species will evolve past such stupidity by the time Mars has been terraformed and made livable without giant glass domes. In short, I am not short-sighted enough to believe that a Russian space race victory would have resulted in World War III like most people that I have discussed this topic with seem to. Instead, I believe it would have been the best outcome, not only for the USSR or for the US, but also for global relations, education, economics, and for the scientific world at large. Onion domes on the moon or not, I would much rather see humanity fulfill its potential and finally begin making the push to see for ourselves whether or not Gene Roddenberry was correct.
Created using Powtoon.